Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, welcome to the Space Policy Show. We have a great episode for you. We are talking about removing obstacles and streamlining launch. As always, please engage with our experts on Twitter using hashtag the Space Policy Show and on Vimeo in the dialogue box. And you can also sign up for our latest news at aerospace.org/policy. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce Carrie O'Quinn. She's a senior project lead in the Office of the Chief Technology Officer at the Aerospace Corporation. Carrie is not only that, but she's an objective project assessments and action-oriented recommendation manager who supports project success for aerospace projects that result in a deliverable product or high-consequence testbed. This is a very important role, as you can imagine. I'm going to turn over to Carrie, where she's going to introduce our other guests and talk a little bit more about her background. Carrie, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for getting us started. I want to welcome everybody who is on the call today. And would like to welcome all of you for tuning in. We're glad to have you joining us to talk about removing some of the obstacles to getting to space for small satellites. As Rebecca mentioned, I am with the Aerospace Corporation. My history with launching satellites goes back about 13 years. Started with the orbital ATK on some different launch vehicles there before coming over to the Aerospace Corporation, where I spent some time advising the National Reconnaissance Office's Office of Space Launch, primarily for rideshare and small satellite launches. And now I've been working with our Innovation Lab and the Chief Technology Office on doing some different innovative things for launch themselves. I'm grateful to be joined today by Tony Frigo, Carrie Mullins, and Mandy Vaughn, each representing a different segment of the launch puzzle. Tony Frigo is the Director of Mission Management on the Spaceflight launch team. Spaceflight is a launch services and mission management provider specializing in identifying, booking, and managing rideshare launches for satellites. Tony was the lead mission manager for the SSOA Small Sat Express mission, which launched 64 spacecraft from 53 organizations on a single Falcon 9. Tony's been directly involved with the launch of 80 spacecraft while at Spaceflight, to include missions from India, New Zealand, and the United States. Prior to this position, he served as the project manager for a 200-pound bipropellant engine produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne, which included performing a multi-year Delta qualification effort. Prior to that, he was the project manager for the booster separation motors and performed post-flight assessments of the reusable solid rocket motors, both of which were an integral part of the NASA Space Shuttle program. Mandy Vaughn is the president of VOX Space. VOX Space is a U.S. incorporated, wholly owned subsidiary of Virgin Orbit, which provides the national security community of the United States and allied nations responsive, dedicated, and affordable launch services for small satellites using Virgin Orbit's Launcher One. Mandy originally joined Virgin Orbit in 2015 as the Senior Director of Business Development and Mission Management. She supported business development on the Launcher One program for both government and commercial customers, and served as mission manager for customers, including OneWeb and NASA, in addition to spearheading the creation and registration of VOX Space. Mandy was also selected to serve on the National Space Council's User Advisory Group, where she helps to streamline coordination and cooperation across the U.S. space enterprise. Prior to joining Virgin Orbit, Mandy was with General Dynamics Mission Systems Space and Intelligence Systems Directorate, where she was responsible for the space control and space protection investment portfolios and analog to digital transitions for a variety of SIGINT payload families. She successfully initiated development programs for the next generation space-based GPS receiver and managed the internal investment of GPS payload development efforts. The third person that I'd like to welcome today is Carrie Mullins. She's a senior engineer at Bryce Space and Technology. Bryce Space and Technology is an analytics and engineering firm that partners with technology and advanced R&D clients. One aspect of their work is to provide comprehensive insight and expertise on the space economy, with an understanding of the complex interplay of national security, civil and commercial space programs, technical capabilities, and markets. Carrie has over 25 years experience analyzing and forecasting aerospace industry markets and advanced technology trends for NASA, the military, and commercial space industry. She's analyzed industry trends and systems to create customized forecast models projecting demand for launch, satellite, and supersonic point-to-point travel. She's also analyzed commercial markets and business cases for exploration technologies, including on-orbit servicing and manufacturing advanced communications and navigation, lunar rovers, and LEO platforms. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. So as you can see, we have a diverse group of people to discuss getting to orbit in a little bit easier manner. We've got, from the launch integration perspective, we've got Tony here. From the launch vehicle perspective and satellite perspective, we've got Mandy, and then we've got Carrie bringing in some more of the analytical information and looking at the industry as a whole. So to get us started, I'd like to talk a little bit about getting to space. So I've heard it said that space is for everyone, but I don't know how true that really is. I mean, once you get past building the satellite and all of its complexities that go along with that, the process for getting to space, the actual launch itself, is very complicated. They don't call it rocket science for nothing. There are a multitude of interfaces, detailed technical and government documentation, and numerous shifting timelines. You can't just buy a plane ticket and get your satellite to a ride to where you want it to go. So it becomes even more challenging when you're a small satellite that doesn't take up much space on the large rockets. So it doesn't make sense to buy a whole rocket when you're a small satellite. Small satellites, those that are generally less than 500 or 600 kilograms, or even in the around 200 kilograms or less range, are often relegated to a rideshare or hitchhiking ride. And we'll talk more about the details of rideshare in a little bit, but before we get into that, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges with launch timelines and delays. So Carrie, I know that Bryce performed a study for Spaceflight on the causes of launch delays, and I was wondering if you could talk to some of the things that you noticed in that study.
Certainly. Thanks, Carrie. Just a little background. This was commissioned by Spaceflight, and the motivation behind this was to provide information to Spaceflight's customers, so to satellite operators, and also to investors who have a lot of money and time invested into launching these satellites, who perhaps don't understand why when they get to the launch segment, they're being delayed, things are taking longer than they thought they should. They hadn't planned for it. So this gives them that information to be able to plan ahead for what might happen. So what we did was we looked at 5 years of commercial small sat launches from 2015 to 2019. That accounted for a little over 1,000 small sats being launched. And we looked at every single one of those launches and assessed if there are any reasons for delays. We found that the median delay is 128 days. And we categorized the causes of launch delay into 8 different categories, which you can see on the chart I provided. The biggest reason for launch delays is the delay of the primary payload. So as Carrie mentioned, often small sats have to go on a launch with another larger primary payload. And if that primary payload is delayed, then the small sat also has to wait. One of the other bigger causes, if you look at the section on this chart in blue, these are delays caused by the launch vehicles. And one of the biggest there is waiting for the launch vehicle to be developed. And so these are satellites that have gotten rides on new vehicles. The new vehicle is perhaps not ready on the timeline that they thought it would be. And as that gets delayed, you have to wait until the launch vehicle is ready. We saw this happen with some of the initial SpaceX Falcon 9 launches. Other reasons for delay might be an earlier launch vehicle anomaly. So say the last launch, something went wrong. It has to be investigated. It has to be fixed. And this will most likely delay the next launch. And then finally, the launch vehicle manufacturing itself can cause a delay or a technical problem with the launch vehicle. The point of being able to understand these for any operator is to be able to plan ahead so that you can add some margins and flexibility, and you know what to expect in your time getting to orbit.
Thanks, Carrie. So 128 days, a little over 4 months. We're talking about a delay for any sort of satellite that comes along for a number of different reasons. So we mentioned a little bit about rideshare. I'd like to talk a little bit about that to give the audience an understanding of the different types of launch, just in case they may not be familiar with it. I like to break launch down into 3 different groups, one being dedicated launch, and that's the traditional launch that you think of: large satellite, large rocket, get to where you want to in space. Those are traditionally what we've launched for decades around the world. The second one is a rideshare launch, where perhaps your primary satellite has a little bit of excess capacity that they aren't going to be using, and to utilize that excess capacity, they're willing to sell off the extra space to a small satellite to get to space. With rideshare, the challenge with that is you have to have a primary satellite who's willing to take on the risk of additional satellites. But we're seeing more and more that is a very common way for small sats to get to space, and most of the primary satellites are getting much more comfortable with it. Then the third piece is a dedicated rideshare launch, which is kind of a combination of the two. There's not a primary satellite that kind of runs the ship and runs the schedule. There are a bunch of different satellites that actually come along to play. And so one of the most famous dedicated rideshare missions that I'm aware of is with Spaceflight. So Tony, Spaceflight had this huge dedicated rideshare mission in the SSOA mission. And I know that you guys have a lot of lessons learned from that mission, and I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through what some of those were.
Sure. I provided a few slides to the group here. If you want to go to slide 2, that's where I'll start. So for those who aren't familiar with SSOA, it was a fully dedicated Falcon 9 rocket that Spaceflight purchased. As Carrie mentioned, there was no prime satellite customer. And really what Spaceflight found was that we had quite a few customers who would traditionally have to hitch a ride on any number of launch vehicles to be able to get that volume into orbit. And what we decided to do was to purchase a whole Falcon 9, design, provide structures, separation systems, avionics, to build this essentially superstructure that would fly on top of the Falcon 9, manifesting all sorts of microsats, anywhere from 30 kilograms to 350 kilograms, all the way down to 1U CubeSats. So it was a really interesting project to be able to work on, and it really supported a great deal of customers in getting them up on orbit. So it was a really interesting project that, as Carrie mentioned, we did learn quite a few things from. So if we transition on to the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about some of those lessons learned that we gained from the mission itself. So just for really briefly, just for a little more background, we primarily used Planetary Systems motorized light bands. We used various interface sizes to support our customers. And there were actually very few customers that required an umbilical, which would typically be used to charge spacecraft leading up to launch. Some of those specific lessons learned that we gleaned from the SSOA mission that would apply to this launch standardization, getting customers up easier, quicker, faster. In terms of mission planning, this was actually hugely challenging. And I'm sure for our customers it was challenging as well. But to try to have 64 different spacecraft, 53 different customers all marching to the same timeline, making sure that the deliverable that customer A got was the same that customer B got. It was a huge logistical effort internally for us to try to coordinate. So that was it was a really hard problem to solve. What we learned is that any changes in deliverables or deliverables and requests have to be made very deliberately. Templates are really, really critical in being able to make sure that the information that's received back is consistent from one customer to the next. We also tried to use digital tools to collaborate between our customers and Spaceflight to try to reduce that time and information being siloed from one organization to the other. Some other really specific ones is battery charging. That was a really challenging part, trying to push customers to have much more capacity with their batteries so that they could stay off for longer periods of time. We actually had to unencapsulate this mission and recharge customer spacecraft, and it was hugely challenging to be able to go through that effort. And then the other kind of element in terms of integration that we learned, trying to have as many customers as we had at the launch site, is to have customers really try to make their operations non-hazardous and to try to bring as few people as possible and to try to make the time that they need at the launch site as little as possible. And in those ways, it somewhat unburdens the actual integration timeline and processing. If we want to go to the next slide, there's some additional specifics that I think would pertain to, again, that launch standardization in general. As we look at, this idea of making it flexible for customers to go from one mission to the next, to the same end of trying to get up on orbit faster, design and test elements, designing to as enveloping an environment as possible is really critical. That basically keeps your launch vehicle options open as long as possible. Or as Carrie mentioned about launch delays, if there is a delay and there's an opportunity to remanifest on another launch vehicle, something that Spaceflight does as much as we can when the opportunity presents itself, that's really critical, such that a customer has already gone through the test. They don't have to repeat a very costly or time-consuming effort of going back through environmental testing. The other one is to, in terms of propulsion, there's a lot of customers now who are including propulsion in their designs, trying to make that propulsion as non-hazardous as possible. Certainly not using hypergalls, which is a very, very challenging thing to work with at the launch site. I already mentioned some of those points on integration, but the other one is in terms of RF testing, again, trying to keep that non-hazardous as much as possible so that there's no risk of harming any other individuals processing at the launch site. And then the one that I mentioned, I'll hit on again, power and umbilical. Try to forego the use of an umbilical. Really try to make sure that your battery can stay off for a long period of time so that if there are delays after integration, you're not in a position where you need to recharge your spacecraft. So it was a really great tool to be able to identify lessons learned in trying to standardize launch vehicles for all customers and to try to make access to space much easier.
Thanks, Tony. So a quick follow-up question for you. How long was the process between deciding to do this mission and getting on contract with SpaceX to launch? And you don't have to give me specifics. Are we talking months or are we talking years?
Oh, gosh. I think all told, it was probably 2-ish years from the time of signing until the time of launch. And as Carrie pointed out, there were a number of factors in there that resulted in delay as part of that mission. But there's obviously just the normal contractual process as well. But we had customers on contract, I think, for that mission for 4 or 5 years, not always signed up for this mission, but who finally got launched with this mission in 2018. So it was a great success.
Yes, definitely. And I'm certain that you didn't change any of your customers, right? The manifest stayed exactly the same the whole time?
Oh, it was a constant churn. I think it's something that comes with these missions is needing to try to be as flexible as late as possible. And some of that Spaceflight can do as the launch service provider. but some of it we need customers' help on. And that was kind of that message at the very end there of trying to do as much testing as you can for an enveloping environment. So that way you could maybe, if there is a delay that means that you can't tolerate, we could try to find another solution for you. So it is, the manifest changes were very, very difficult. It was something that all of those things helped out with, templates and getting people up to speed, but it was a very challenging problem to solve.
So I'm going to give the audience a little bit of insight into the traditional rideshare on a large satellite launch and the typical timeline for that. So typically speaking, you're talking about identifying your launch, if you're a small sat, 2 to 4 years prior to launch. This is what it's been typically on the big launches. 2 to 4 years before the launch, you are going to identify which specific launch vehicle you're going to go on. And not only that, but we tend to, from a launch vehicle perspective, require you to give us as much information at the beginning as possible. So the analogy I like to use is, imagine that you want to go to Fiji on vacation and you need to buy your plane ticket 2 to 4 years in advance. And you have to tell them your height and weight and what size suitcase you are taking from a dimensions perspective and mass. And if any of that changes in the next 2 to 4 years, you're going to have a lot more work to do from the launch vehicle or the airplane perspective on this. And you're going to have to pay some penalties. And that's the way we've typically done rideshare on these large launch vehicles before. So now, Mandy, looking over to the small launch providers and some of the efficiencies that they can bring, how does that process change, and what does this look like from a small launch perspective?
Great question, and I think it's interesting because a lot of the technical elements that we see from our perspective as a dedicated small launch provider are exactly the same as what Tony has mentioned from the dedicated rideshare perspective. So it really is, this whole part of the market can really benefit from a lot of the exact same things that he mentioned in terms of the integration timelines, et cetera. Another element of it is we really can, with both the dedicated as well as the dedicated small launchers, we can really think about standardization differently and kind of loosen the envelope a bit, because we don't need to necessarily restrict ourselves or small satellites into such a restricted form factor like a CubeSat. Or even if you still want to stick with CubeSats, because that is great and it is pretty ubiquitous, to be able to move to a more mass efficient structure to where we can have a manifest with a variety of different payloads, where we can have a much more efficient payload stack. But a lot of times these containerized payload constructs came about because we were working in a construct like you were just describing, where we had to basically define where our airline seat and our luggage 2 to 4 years ahead of time. So without having a primary on the top that might be a $1 billion asset, the do no harm requirements are very different. The whole technical baseline of the environments around this mission can be very different. So I really look at this in terms of 3 elements. First, technically, regulatory, and then also culturally. So we'll start with technical. So everything Tony said, I think, is exactly spot on. The other elements of it, not just with the enveloping environments, is you're looking at one mission or one provider, really looking at the efficiency of the pre-flight analysis, if you will. Can we really look in terms of then our own responsiveness and our own internal manifest flexibility? Can we look at various configurations where, rather than having just one 3U or a mix of 3Us and 6Us, is there kind of a standard set of maybe 10 or 12 common payload configurations that one launch vehicle can provide, and basically get all the analysis out of the way? And that way, a payload of one close form factor can then just quickly be swapped for another. And where I think this could really, we do this sometimes, but I'd like to open the boundaries. If you can just say, hey, your CG is within a range of X, your moment of inertia hasn't changed more than this, you can just swap it in. So that way we can really think about your airline example again. If we can just define the airline seat, you could exchange your ticket and basically sit into any other seat, because even though airline seats are small, we know that we can fit. So another, that is kind of the pre-planned trajectories. And that kind of also leads into my next point on the regulatory front. Launch license timelines, even if you've got in a row, are 6 months. So especially if we're looking not just in terms of manifest flexibility, but then also leading into space and space launch responsiveness, if we can have not just some of these mission centers of gravity, moments of inertia, hazardous analyses pre-planned, we could also have the flight plans pre-planned. So rather than having to decide today, hey, the orbit's going to be exactly this, if we have a variety of orbits for a variety of payloads already basically certified and approved by the FAA, then we can basically pick and choose much closer to the actual launch event, which one we actually want to go run a COLA against and fly. So I kind of liken that to the ground-based missile defense example. So you've got these missile interceptors that are sitting there ready to go, and they're not having to calculate the entire trajectory mission by mission. They're already pre-programmed with planned trajectories, because we kind of know about where the targets will come in from. So then you just have to decide at the last minute, which way is it going to fly? So we could do that with common orbits of interest and common payload characteristics. So then the third leg here, really the cultural piece, is we do have to then, whether you're talking about within one launch itself, exchanging manifest, or like Tony mentioned, being able to remanifest yourself onto another launch vehicle. This is very different culturally, both for the launch provider, the launch integrator, and for groups like you've supported, Carrie, the customer. So I think a big part of that is in the contractual relationships, the requirements baselines. How do you want to decide to design your satellite from the beginning? But where I really kind of foot stomp then, just thinking about space and manifesting onto your launch vehicle way more flexibly. Just last week, we supported a virtual tour with a whole bunch of brand new second lieutenants that just got commissioned into the US Space Force. These are brand new lieutenants. And one of them asked the question of, what about the challenge of horizontal integration? And do we think that we can cross that bridge? And, we were just kind of like, oh my, and I actually had someone that had worked on GPS-3 with me said, well, we really tackled that with large Air Force satellites with GPS-3 that was horizontally integrated to launch on a SpaceX Falcon 9. So, but just to hear this from a brand new minted second lieutenant in the Space Force just is an indicator to me on terms of being able to think space can be for everyone if we really do kind of think about what is the baseline, how rapidly can we manifest something, what are some smart early technical decisions, and our risk posture. So I think those are kind of the big rocks in my mind between the technical, the regulatory, and the cultural and risk-taking perspective that all need to have some attention for us to really be able to take advantage of what could be possible here.
Yeah, I agree, Mandy. I feel like we need to kind of make a change in the thought process of perhaps trading one inefficiency in order to gain efficiencies elsewhere, right? So for the longest time, we were launching very rarely. And so we wanted to make sure that that satellite was perfect in every way and the most efficient way that we can do that. Now that we're starting to see launches go up more often and more frequently, perhaps we can get a little more inefficient on the satellite side. It's maybe blasphemous for some to hear, in order to gain more efficiency on the launch side. The launch vehicle itself is such a small portion of the life of that satellite, and yet we require it to be so specialized and so unique for each specific satellite. One of the things that we've been working on at Aerospace with the industry at large is trying to define some standards around non-containerized small sats. So what I mean by that, we've talked a little bit about CubeSats, and for those that might not be familiar with CubeSats, they're a standard size satellite that each U is approximately 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters. Then as you add to it, you get 1, 2, 3U and larger. However, the kind of benefit of a CubeSat is it's inside of a container. And so you can swap out CubeSats inside of that container relatively easily. There are some challenges, as Mandy was talking about, some of the regulatory challenges, and Tony had talked about any of the other special needs that a satellite would have to have, but that's easier. However, the container itself is what I like to call parasitic mass, right? You are launching something that has no value to the actual mission other than holding it in place until you put it in space. So can we look at larger satellites that can do more mission, that are not containerized, but still have the same benefits of the CubeSat form factor? So the first kind of iteration of this is the launch unit work that Aerospace was working on, also known as Launch U, that would in fact create that airline seat. It would tell you exactly what that airline seat could handle, and it would bound it in such a way from a mechanical and electrical standpoint that you don't need the umbilicals like Tony was talking about. The umbilicals would be those that are providing power to your spacecraft. Your batteries can handle being off for a long period of time. Your system can handle that. And then mechanically, it is the same sort of interface from the launch vehicle perspective, so they don't have to redo all of their analyses. That is one thing that we've been looking at from a Launch U perspective, and we actually asked Bryce to take a look at whether or not this would provide benefits to the industry. And so Carrie, I was wondering if you could touch on some of that study as well.
Sure. I do have one chart on that as well. As Carrie mentioned, they asked us to look, sorry about that. As Carrie mentioned, they asked us to look at the business-oriented benefits for the Launch U. And we looked at them from the perspective of launch manufacturers and operators, from the perspective of launch providers, the government. And as the chart shows, we hypothesized a number of benefits, including reduced costs and streamlined processes, and enabling swapping satellites between vehicles, and then also enabling a launch provider to swap satellites, so from both sides. While we were doing this study, and we interviewed experts from all three of these particular sectors, we discovered that there was another group that could particularly benefit, and that's space entrepreneurs. And as we know, venture capital investment in space continues to go up every year. There's a lot of interest in space, and having this Launch U standard also provides some benefits to them. Through all of our interviews, the experts basically agreed that these were definitely the top benefits, but I can go into some of the more interesting specifics. There's about 30 charts of findings on here, so I'm just going to hit the top line ones. In terms of cost, for reducing manufacturing cost and time, when you have a standard Launch U, you would get more standardized components and hardware. And this was mentioned. What then happens is once you get standardized, you can get more suppliers. The reduced customization gets you some increased economies of scale. On the launch side, as was mentioned by both Mandy and Tony, the engineering analysis is a big part of the cost and the pre-launch process. And all of the experts mentioned that having a standardized form factor, having common hardware and interfaces could lead to potentially standard engineering analysis products that would really manage to decrease this time and the overall pre-launch process. Another big one was, in fact, being able to swap out satellites. So as you get more standardized with your common hardware and interfaces, then you can start to look at the idea that if the primary payload's not ready, as we saw as a large problem for launch delays, can I get on another launch? Now that I have a standard, they're kind of plug and play, and I can jump on the next launch. Or from the launch provider perspective, somebody's not ready to go. Who can I replace them with? When you're looking at more of this small satellite launch shares. From the government perspective, they discussed the idea that this could help with being more responsive. It's easier to kind of get through your build to get into orbit faster. If you have bulk launch purchases, which the government has been interested in, it has done, you could also allow trades among the bulk launches that you purchased. So say your one satellite's not ready for the first one, you could swap it out with another one. And then finally, as I mentioned, we discovered a number of our experts brought up entrepreneurs, and that one of the issues for new entrants into space, and I believe Carrie mentioned it's not always that easy to get in, is there's not a lot of guidance, open source, on how to develop and launch satellites. So the CubeSat, with its standardization, is actually the closest to having something like that and the easiest. But the experts all kind of agreed that having a standard would simplify this process for entrepreneurs. It really makes it a lot more transparent what they need to do. It provides mass and volume targets for the manufacturing. It provides a lot more transparency into the end-to-end costs, and that includes the launch costs. And it also allows them to plan a little better, because for an entrepreneur who's your time to market, so getting on orbit first is really important. And so being able to understand and be ready for what's going to come up and potentially have a lot more flexibility so that they can get on orbit faster is really important for them.
Thanks, Carrie. So, Mandy, I wanted to chat with you as the launch vehicle person on our panel here. If we start to get to a point where we standardize what that interface looks like, does that then de-incentivize a launch vehicle provider from the standpoint of not being able to differentiate yourselves from other launch vehicle providers?
Not really. I think there's some degree of that with a small part of the customer base, where if your metric really is all about just mass to orbit, maybe so, but it is still beneficial for the customer. But there are still elements to where there might be different mission needs or mission threads or priorities to where different launch providers would still have kind of their own unique niche, if you will, whether that be just kind of the experience or their geographic location to you. Rather than sending a satellite halfway around the world for a launch integration, is there something closer to home that just kind of minimizes the cost of kind of the whole architecture from one perspective, as well as in some degrees in terms of time and responsiveness. And that's part of where we're interested in what we're really seeing from a lot of the US government, and even on NASA from a science side. If you need to respond to quickly, there's an element of operational mobility that then we can really, I think, exploit more efficiently, which can still allow someone to be quite differentiated. And I really like what Carrie said in terms of this study, and just wanted to add two things to her remarks. I think one thing, technical compatibility from the standardization perspective is fantastic. But the other thing where you have to have compatibility is in the payload's risk posture. So you can't use Air Force parlance, you can't just substitute a mission assurance category 1 with a category 3.
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to make sure that from that mission assurance requirements perspective, they can also swap out. And I do also like, as I mentioned, the benefit of standardization, because it allows a new entrant to focus on what's hard. Learning how to create a satellite, a bus, integrate it with a space vehicle, integrate it with a launch vehicle. For someone that's trying to invent the newest, greatest sensor thingy, let them focus on the thingy. And this sort of standardization could really help enable them to really have more rapid access to space and not have to worry about recreating the hard part all of us can just be ready for them, which I think is very attractive.
Thanks, Mandy. I appreciate that. Tony, from an integrator perspective, same sort of question. Do you see that the integrators might not have as much of a differentiating possibility for if every single satellite looked the same?
I tend to think the same way as Mandy does. I think there are still differentiators there. And I think it's a great goal to try to have a standardized size small sat. But I think even with CubeSats, you see them in non-standard form factors. There are different dispensers that accommodate different sized CubeSats. So I think it's a noble goal, but I think there are still going to be certain things that would either separate integrators or even launch vehicles. Some great points that Mandy had there in terms of, thinking about the integrator's role in terms of separation systems and how we interface with the launch vehicle. There'll be a great importance on that as well. So I don't think it necessarily de-incentivizes us. I think between launch vehicles, the integrators, and the customers, I think we're all trying to approach the same thing, which is to try to standardize as much as possible so that we can get the most folks into orbit as soon as possible. And so whoever does that standardization, whether it be the integrator, the launch vehicle provider, the customer, if we all just kind of approach the same point, I think we'll be in a great position.
That's great, Tony. Thanks. And I think that pretty much sums up the discussion that we had today. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to chat with me today about trying to improve our access to space, especially for small satellite providers, and get us there in a way that is a little more efficient from a cost and timeline perspective, and see if there are ways that we can find some standardization to improve the process. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you.
Well, Corbin, Dallas, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode on removing obstacles and streamlining launch. Thank you so much to Carrie, Tony, Mandy, and Carrie. Please, again, engage with our experts on Twitter, # the Space Policy Show, or on Vimeo in the little dialogue box below the video. And please sign up for our news alerts. Corbin says, please, at aerospace.org/policy. He would love to have your email on our list so we can make sure that you have the latest and greatest. Until next time, take care.